incredible organizers. Isa Borgeson is an organizer with the Ella Baker Center in Oakland, California, focusing on rapid response campaign work to support incarcerated communities during the COVID-19 pandemic at San Quentin State Prison and at prisons, jails, and detention centers across the state through the hashtag Stop San Quentin Outbreak campaign coalition. James King is the state campaigner for the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. Prior to joining the organization, James worked to build recognition of the value of people who are being held in carceral spaces. His current policy interests include decarceration and improving the living conditions for incarcerated people, with the ultimate goal of creating alternatives to incarceration based upon investing in under-resourced communities. And to start us off, Jarrett, a co-organizer with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign, is going to be giving us a little bit of background on the history of San Quentin. And I also wanted to shout out the San Quentin Canteen Fund, where you can give directly to folks inside. And I'm pasting the link in the chat right now, so please feel free to join the group and give there. Thanks. Handing it off to Jarrett.
Hey everyone, my name is Jarrett and I'm an organizer with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. My pronouns are he, him, his. So we're here today to learn about how people at San Quentin are currently organizing amidst the COVID-19 pandemic. But before we do that, we thought it would be important to understand the long lineage of inside, outside organizing at San Quentin. And if there's a single place, and of course we can't say that there's one single place, but if we had to name a single place that could be identified as the birthplace of the contemporary abolitionist struggle, it would be San Quentin. So on August 7th, 1970, exactly 50 years and 24 days ago, Jonathan Jackson organized a takeover of the Marin County Courthouse, taking a judge, a district attorney, and several members of the jury hostage in order to free his older brother, George Jackson, who along with Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchette had been charged with the murder of a guard at Soledad Prison. And the three men became known as the Soledad Brothers, given that each of them were charged with the officer's murder because of their organizing activities at Soledad. Chances are that if you're here today, you've heard of George Jackson. You may have read his book, Soledad Brother, or seen any number of the documentaries about his life. Or, like me, you may have learned from the Toni Morrison documentary, The Pieces I Am, that Toni Morrison edited George's book of revolutionary theory, Blood in My Eye, when she was an editor at Random House. But in paying so much attention to George Jackson and the well-earned acclaim, we forget about his other two comrades, Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchette. So I thought that the best way to uplift these two brothers was to read an excerpt from a letter written by John Cluchette. In this letter from 1970, he is writing to a woman on the outside who's asked him for his thoughts on the issue of prison reform. And Cluchette responded as so. I'm just gonna go into share screen mode so you can see what I see. So John Cluchette, when asked about prison reform, said, quote, "We must analyze the term reform, prison reform, and its fundamental objective. There is but one imperative, overhaul, which means changing the frame on the wall, but not the picture itself. On the one hand, it brings into existence a new policy of administrative control. The order of old rules and regulations are reorganized and formulated to fit a new pacification program. This program is designed and regulated to pacify inmates by offering them a movie, a new radio station, a new and freshly painted cell, bars included, but no immediate parole. In short, the objective is to keep the inmate happy and the assembly lines rolling. On the other hand, it maintains the use of weapon control, changing the frame but not the picture. It carries out the use of tear gas, billy clubs, pig handles, the sweat box, solitary lockup, a prison within a prison, and the use of 30-30 automatic rifles." He continues, "Today's prison system should be abolished because it is a system pre-designed and constructed to warehouse the people of undeveloped and lower economical communities. Under the existing social order, men and women are sent to prison for labor, free labor, and further economical gain, money by the state. Where else can you get a full day's work for 2 to 16 cents an hour? And these hours become an indeterminate period of years. This is slave labor in 20th century America. Repeat, men and women are sent to prison for free labor, not for what contributions they might make to their communities under the guise of rehabilitation. So again, that was John Cluchet's letter in 1970. George Jackson was killed in a so-called prison escape in August of 1971. The next year, in 1972, Fleta Drumgo and John Cluchet were acquitted on the case at Soledad, but Cluchet remained in prison until just 2 years ago, when he was finally released on June 16th, in large part due to people organizing on the outside. And here are the first words he gave following his release. So I'm gonna go into share screen mode again.
Now, so this is the video now. You have anything you want to say?
Oh, it is?
Yeah.
Oh, well, I want to thank everybody that supported me, especially Mr. Wadley and Angela Bell from Louisiana State University, and everybody that's written the governor in support of me all these years. I don't know how to thank you, but thank you.
I think the case of the Soledad brothers and John Cluchet in particular, but also the campaigns to free Angela Davis and Assata Shakur, speak to the importance of inside and outside organizing. California has always been ground zero for this type of solidarity. And so with that, I will pass it to Shruti to be in conversation with our guests here tonight.
Thanks for that background, Jarrett. That was really powerful. So some context on the hashtag Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition. On May 30th, there was a transfer of 121 incarcerated folks from the California Institution for Men to San Quentin State Prison in the Bay Area. The Alla Baker Center, which is where Issa and James are based out of, is in Oakland, California, also in the Bay. And so at the time of this transfer of 121 folks, CIM was already a known hotspot for the coronavirus. And at that point, San Quentin State Prison did not have any COVID cases. And since then, there have been over 2,200 cases inside the prison. And it's really been a huge effort on the part of this coalition to combat the folks getting sick and just all of the calamity that has happened under the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. And this is just expanding by the day across the state. And so this is really important to understand in this current moment and support organizers who are doing that work right now and just be in the know. With that, we'll get started with our Q&A. So we have some questions, but also feel free to add any questions to the chat. We will have a Q&A where you guys can ask your questions and we'll address them at the end. Yeah, so let's get started. My first question to both of y'all is, what is happening at San Quentin across California right now? And can you give us an overview of the demands from San Quentin?
Thanks. I'll go first. Yeah, first, thanks for inviting us. And always excited to talk about and raise awareness about the conditions in California state prisons. Frankly, what's happening is outrageous, and it's a human-made disaster on top of a natural disaster that should not be tolerated. I appreciate Jared giving us a little bit of San Quentin's positionality in abolition history, but I want to ground San Quentin a little bit in how the facility operates today. And for context, I just left San Quentin about 9 months ago. I'm a recently returning citizen. San Quentin is probably closest to, on the East Coast, Norfolk Prison, which I believe is in Massachusetts. The school that, or the prison that Malcolm X attended, that had the college program and several things that enabled him to learn and create the space for critical thought in his own life. San Quentin, for many years, for the last 15 or 20 years, had been positioning itself as the vanguard for rehabilitative prisons in the world, really. Like it wanted to say that this was going to be the new model for what incarceration would look like. And it was trying to position itself as a more humane alternative that even as the numbers of incarcerated people came down, they offered all of these quote unquote rehabilitative services that would then make people safe for reentry. And so what that means in practical terms is that you had to earn your way to San Quentin for the last 20 years. And the majority of people who are there are people who have been incarcerated 20, 30, 40, even 50 years with very limited disciplinary histories. And we can talk about like the problems with that, just a disciplinary history framing. But the bottom line is the prison is majority of people who are up in age. And the prison itself is the oldest prison, active operating prison in the state of California, built in the 1850s, where there's no ability to protect yourself from a pandemic or an outbreak. Prior to the outbreak occurring at San Quentin, public health officials, legislators, community members raised the alarm that if the virus ever entered into that prison, it would result in horrific conditions. And that, in fact, is what happened. I don't know how closely people are tracking this, but 19 of the 20 largest outbreaks in this country have been in prisons or jails or carceral spaces. The largest outbreak being San Quentin. In California state prisons, over 10,000 people have been infected with this virus in the last 6 months. At least 58 have died in custody. There have also been documented cases of people being released and dying shortly thereafter. That does not count the close to 2,500 staff members who were infected throughout the state and the deaths that occurred of staff as well. So by any measure, this is just a hugely colossal crisis that is not being addressed. And it's our position that there is no way to successfully deal with mitigating pandemics without dealing with the largest congregate settings in our midst, which are prisons, carceral spaces, and jails. I'll pause there and toss over to Issa to talk a little bit about the demands in the right now.
Yeah. Hi, everybody. My name is Issa. I use she, they pronouns. Yeah, excited to be building with y'all and learning from one another, learning more from James. I feel like our one-on-ones together that we have every week, I'm just like writing down hella information. So I'm always, blessed to be working with y'all. And yeah, I do work with the Stop San Quentin Outbreak Coalition that Shruti was naming. You know, we came together after the transfer and we knew, I think for our first like press conference that we did, James, there was like, I think the first flyer said like 25 people have COVID-19 at San Quentin. And that was, and we knew that it was going to be an outbreak. We know that prisons, prison facilities, ICE detention centers, jails, federal prisons, private prisons, everything. We know that are not safe. Nor do they promote safety or humanity within the context of COVID-19 and beyond the context of COVID-19, right? So I think it's really important that as we're doing this work of rapid response work, responding to the folks who are getting sick and dying inside prison facilities across California, across the nation, we're also understanding that there is no way to make a prison safer. And what we really need is mass releases. What we really need is mass decarceration and alternatives to prisons and policing and surveillance systems and no surveillance systems. So we've been working with folks currently incarcerated inside San Quentin State Prison from the very beginning of this. I think it's really important when we're talking about inside-outside strategies to know that if the demands, assessment of needs, and the vision for your organizing is for a community that you are not currently part of, then it doesn't make sense. It has to be led the vision has to be led by folks who are currently incarcerated at San Quentin, since we were talking about that work. So if y'all haven't seen already, I think I can drop the link, or someone can drop the link. I can drop it real quick, to demands that we co-collaborated with folks inside San Quentin for. Some like high level, but the first and top priority is that Governor Newsom and CDCR, or the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, which is the department that runs all of the state prisons throughout California, must grant large scale releases. And we said at least to get to the level of below 50% of current capacity. And I think James is always really helpful for me in terms of pushing this number of like our understandings of current capacity of a prison is based on what they said was the capacity for a prison that was built in the 1850s. It's not based on what the actual capacity for a prison is during a global pandemic, or during just the reality that this prison is literally falling apart, and is the oldest prison built in California. We also have talked to a lot of community members because we've gotten feedback from folks in community about how to make our demands more inclusive of folks who often aren't included in these calls for releases. So we try to really include folks who have death sentences, who often are not considered, who entirely are not considered for these early releases that are granted by Governor Newsom or by CDCR. We also talk about folks with LWOP, life without parole sentences. We also want to really name the transgender community inside San Quentin, and everywhere across all prison facilities, right? But understanding that like even during this COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of trans community, non-binary, trans women, genderqueer folks were denied their hormones during this time, during COVID-19, as a medical procedure that people were saying like, oh, all of these really transphobic excuses that were given to deny trans folks their hormones while they were inside San Quentin or immediately after the release. So it's really important that we name those folks specifically. And our second demand is to stop all transfers between prisons, and also folks who are undocumented. A lot of times when they get released from prisons, they're transferred to ICE detention centers, which is another place in which the COVID-19 pandemic is running rampant. Our third demand is for ongoing and adequate testing for 100% of the prison population. Fourth demand is for correctional officers to regulate themselves into one part of the prison. What we kept on seeing is that even during times where people were on lockdown or being quarantined in certain areas, that the virus was spreading throughout the different buildings and the different housing units of San Quentin, because correctional officers were wanting to get their overtime, so they would go from one housing unit to another without any type of regulation. So I think a lot of times people talk about this really sensationalized kind of thing about, oh, if incarcerated folks are released from prisons, that they'll bring that virus into our communities, which we just know from looking at the numbers is not true. And we just know that nothing beyond a prison can replicate the conditions of the prison, and that communities who are able to care for our own communities and are able to help and support our community members to be able to quarantine themselves with safe housing, et cetera, like that. I bring that up because a lot of people, when they're arguing about these cases of folks supposedly bringing COVID-19 when they're released from prison, they don't talk about how many times correctional officers are moving from building to building within the prison, or each day after their 8-hour day shifts are leaving the prison and going to their communities and risking exposure in that way. And then we also have some demands that are focused on the conditions inside prison. One being credit earning programs. So a lot of the really important credit earning programs that folks were engaged in have been completely stopped because of COVID-19. So there are certain like rehabilitative programs, college courses, GED courses that people have been using to just engage with, and also has been taking time off their sentence. So it's calling for that. And then number 6 is just access to PPE and other necessary supplies that's not PPE too. Like, shit, people need stamps. Like, you know, a lot of folks, my loved one who's in San Quentin, you know, has had a job at San Quentin before, but because there is no more jobs that are happening, folks who don't have assistance from family and loved ones inside, who can't put money on their canteen, who can't afford certain of the essential goods like stamps or like food that they can purchase, things like that, that needs to be made free to all folks who are incarcerated. And 7, what is 7? Okay, yes, I think we're gonna talk about this later too, but just visiting has been canceled since the beginning of COVID-19. So asking for televisiting privileges and also asking for free phone calls. I'm sure everyone on here knows about how fucked up the phone calling system is and how expensive it is for folks, and how many folks aren't able to keep in contact with their loved ones who are currently incarcerated because of how expensive it is, and just the profiteering off of mass incarceration, criminalization, and racism that happens in the prison industrial complex, and the need for free phone calls throughout the entirety. So I'm gonna shut up and pass it back to whoever is talking next.
We can move on to the next question. Thank you so much for running through all those demands and naming all the groups and issues that you're fighting for. Our next question is, how have the fires impacted folks inside? I know that's super recent, but if you could speak to that a little bit.
Sure, and one of the things that came up for me, even in seeing this question, is just wishing we were able to have someone who's currently incarcerated in California state prisons on this call right now to answer that question for themselves. I very much see my role as speaking like in a space where they're not allowed, but if they're allowed, like I always want to like prioritize their voices and allow them to speak for themselves. To answer the question about the fires and how they're impacting folks inside, California state prisons have extremely poor ventilation and they're incredibly overcrowded. For instance, West Block at San Quentin is designed to hold about 400 people, and there are close to 800 people in that building as we speak. The windows are welded shut for security purposes, and the ventilation system itself has not operated that anyone knows of in the last 5 years. Perhaps beyond that it did, but certainly for the last 5 years it hasn't operated one time. What they do is they have ducts that kind of like allow some of the air from outside to filter in. So you have tons of people who are living in these concrete boxes without lack of proper ventilation. And the air that they are currently getting is, or was during the height of the fires, was the air quality was extremely harmful and dangerous. The prison was passed out some N95 masks, some of the higher grade masks. Certainly not enough, and certainly not consistently enough to have any impact. Another result, or another way that the fires have been impacting folks is this. Part of the conversation around reentry and reducing the incarcerated numbers of people inside is influenced by the fact that California has a very large incarcerated firefighting corps. Like they use incarcerated labor to fight fires. And in fact, I was listening to a news report the other day that said it saves the state over $100 million. Because of the way that they prioritized doing their incremental and modest releases of releasing a few people early who happened to be near their release dates, it was disproportionately from fire camps that people were released. And therefore, the incarcerated labor was not available. And so what we're seeing in California is, oh my goodness, we can't let them go because we need the labor to fight the fires, which is really foul when you realize that those people don't just disappear because they leave the gates. Those trained firefighters are still available and could still and probably willingly go fight the fires if systemic bias did not prevent them from being hired as firefighters once they're released. So the fires are being used to argue against certain releases and as an argument to continue the labor. And those who are not in those types of facilities, but are instead in just regular housing prisons, are not able to go outside and get a breath of fresh air. They are constantly inhaling the smoke and the harmful toxins from the fires.
Thanks for that. Next question is, what are the impacts that loved ones and communities are feeling between lack of visits and lack of information?
Hi. Okay, I'm also just gonna drop in this toolkit that TGIJP put together for more on the California wildfire too. Because as we know, just adding to what James said, Vacaville fires, even when there was mandatory evacuations for the neighborhoods that included the two prisons in that neighborhood of Solano State Prison and CMS. They were refusing to evacuate folks or even consider a plan for if folks needed to be evacuated. And thankfully, folks are okay, whatever that means, but also just knowing how that could have gone. So folks at TGIJP, and if you don't know them, Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project, that do a lot of work with trans and queer communities who are currently and formerly incarcerated. You should definitely check out their work. But that's a toolkit if you want to learn more. And in terms of folks who, families, I have a loved one inside of San Quentin who's been incarcerated for the past 12 years, has been incarcerated at San Quentin for going on 2 years in October. And that's actually how I know James, of hearing amazing stories from my loved one about how incredible of an organizer James is inside. And I remember first getting to meet James through this Stop San Quentin Outbreak work and seeing him on a Zoom call and being like, I met you, yay. I think, the fact that folks have been, how many months is this? March through August? It's 5 or 6 months where folks have not been able to visit their loved ones inside. The fact that there is not communication. I mean, I think about the work that Restore Justice is doing to really try to support families who, when their loved ones go out to hospital, are not being notified about what is happening to their loved ones, or even that their loved ones know that they're at a hospital or are calling to ask, where's my loved one, what's the information? And because of medical policies about being able to share information and HIPAA and whatnot, that folks are not getting the information that they really need, even when they do have the forms that CDCR requires. And so I think that work is really important. It's really, of course, so important for loved ones. And I'm sure I cannot speak as a person who has not been incarcerated before, but I know it's hard. And I have the privilege that my loved one is in H unit, which is he got moved to H unit the day of that they first did the quarantine shelter in place and announced that visits were shut off for their indefinite future for however long it took. And so he has a lot more access to phone calls than other folks, but I know a lot of people who I've built community with just through our shared friendship in the hallways of San Quentin at 8 in the morning, 7 in the morning, waiting for hours and hours for our appointment time, having to share clothes with one another when there's some arbitrary call by a correctional officer who tells us that the pants that we wear every single week to go inside to see our loved one are against regulation. And that type of community of folks who just are not able to have consistent phone calls with their loved ones because of what it looked like inside and the regulations that they put on phones. So it's very hard to not be able to have communication and in-person visits with my loved one. What say you, James?
I was just thinking about it as you were talking, and I was remembering during the height of the outbreak, there were 2,200 people who were infected. CDCR, San Quentin, would not release information to families about people's health status. And that included if a person went to a hospital. The family would never know that their loved one was out on a ventilator. The first notification the family might receive was if the person died, and then the CDCR would notify them. And then with the 26 people who died at San Quentin in the last 90 days due to COVID, because of their interpretation of privacy laws, the only people that they named were people who had been on death row, which, you know, created this distortion that people felt like, oh my God, these people are horrible who are dying of this. So there was less sensitivity to what was occurring. And so those were just some of the ways that the information flow affected those of us with loved ones inside. The one other thing that I would say is hospitals quickly grow overwhelmed by a pandemic or an outbreak. There's no doubt that a prison cannot deal with it in the slightest. So when the outbreak was at its height, there was no information flowing between staff and the incarcerated population there. And it was really jarring to get calls from people on the inside just asking what was happening in their own building. And had I heard from their loved ones who might just be on another tier in the same building. So the lack of information and transparency and communication that comes from a culture that prisons have, where staff understand how to use information as power, and how that played out during the midst of this pandemic was extremely inhumane as well.
I wanted to ask y'all about your experiences with the prison industrial complex and how we share responsibility in destroying it.
You want me to go first, Issa? One thing that I've always believed is that our criminalization system impacts everybody. You are either benefited by it and it protects your status quo in this world, or it disenfranchises you and marginalizes you and seeks to control you through state-sanctioned violence. So we all have a relationship with this current criminalization system that we have in place right now. And for those who are benefiting from it, that means that your lifestyle is being subsidized by state-sanctioned violence. I want to point out that our criminal codes, our laws that criminalize are highly subjective. We live in a country where it's illegal to go into a Walgreens and steal aspirin, but it's not illegal to deny someone health care. So we have these subjective laws that strongly benefit those who are privileged and the most powerful among us. And so therefore, if that bothers you, if you feel that you do not want your life to be subsidized by state-sanctioned violence, then there's a responsibility in tearing it down and reimagining a different future. Like, there is no pathway to safety that comes from violence. It doesn't exist. And we need to, and we especially need the next generation to set that principle as a North Star, as a lodestar, and move us towards it.
Yeah, appreciate you, James, and all the knowledge. Yeah, I think I'm forgetting the question, but it's what are your experiences with the PIC and how do we share? Yeah, I think we all share responsibility in destroying the prison industrial complex. I think, just specifically calling on white folks, calling on non-Black POC folks to do our role, and myself as a white and person of color, mixed race person, just knowing that the ways in which the prison industrial complex is set up, specifically in its anti-Black violence, anti-Indigenous violence, that, you know, there's work that needs to be done. And I think that there is no movement towards freedom that's not led by Black trans femmes folks. There is no movement towards freedom that's not led by currently and formerly incarcerated folks. And you have some of our strongest organizers who have been most impacted by state systems of violence, who are literally locked in cages right now. And, you know, it's part of our work. That's what we got to do.
Thanks for sharing that. That there is no path to safety that's predicated upon violence. Who do you take inspiration from?
You want me to go first? I take inspiration from James. I'm sure we'll probably have like similar things. I think we were talking about this answer before, and just yeah, currently incarcerated folks. My loved one, Adamu, he gives me reading assignments and things like that. And Adamu first got incarcerated when I was 17, I think, and now I'm 29. Yeah, when I was 17. And I think so much of my learning has happened directly through the relationships and friendships and solidarity that I have with folks who are currently incarcerated, especially him. But I think, you know, when we're doing this work, I think it's really important that like we're organizing and we're doing work, and we also have commitments through the relationships and the right relationships that we're creating with our folks who are most impacted. And I think a lot of times that gets like overlooked in our, like, you know, we have to get this Zoom meeting out, or we got to get this, you know, agenda together. We got to send out these notes and things like that. But if it's not starting from a place of relationship, which I think like our relationships is like the anti-capitalist work, it is like the dismantling of systems by holding our accountabilities to folks, not just like nameless like theories or associations with groups of people, but like people who, when I ask myself, like, who am I accountable to, that I know their names, faces, their mamas, their communities, I think is really important to this work. And yeah, I also really push for transformative justice as an alternative to prisons, or it's not an alternative, it's the deconstructing of prisons and what that looks like in communities, and how can we hold community accountability processes that address violence that we experience, interpersonal violence, state violence, violence amongst our loved ones, and in our partnerships and relationships and friendships. And so I look to folks like Miriam Kaba, I look to folks like Shira Hassan. Out here in the Bay, we have a Bay Area Transformative Justice Collective that's led by Mia Mingus, who creates incredible work around this. And other people who influence my work is Ruthie Gilmore. I'll always credit Golden Gulag as one of the first like abolitionist works that I cited, and all the Black and Indigenous mentors, elders, and professors and folks in my community with and without college education that really steered my education, my political commitments, and who taught me like who I'm accountable to and what communities I must serve.
Not sure there's much I can add to that. I'm definitely inspired by everyone that Issa just named. And like probably the only writer I would add to that list for me personally has been James Baldwin, in just his writing and thinking about the toxicity of race and critical contributions to critical race theory have been hugely important for me. But yeah, I think that the biggest by far inspiration for me as it relates to this work is just the relationships I formed while walking on prison yards for a decade and a half, and seeing just people trying to have some quality of life and making the best, and showing a resilience that just like our society really needs. And I think that like I know what it feels like to feel marginalized, disenfranchised, forgotten. The walls are not just literal; they hugely metaphorical. You feel unseen, and so a huge part of the inspiration for me is giving people on the inside a sense that yes, we see you, and we want to create ways for you to advocate for yourself.
Thank you for naming all those folks. And I want to ask one last question before we open it up for a Q&A from the audience, so folks can start typing the questions into the chat. My last question is, what are your short-term and long-term aspirations for the movement, and what are the avenues that we envision using to free them all?
Our short-term goal is to bring the population at San Quentin down to at least below 50%. That's and to continue to block and stop transfers and all of the other demands that currently incarcerated people have asked us to amplify. That's those are our short-term aspirations. Long-term, like, we want to build be on the side of building a world that does not rely upon violence and punishment to create safety and security for some. We want to end prisons and end this just inhumane treatment of people based upon an outdated and outmoded moral code that is heavily influenced by our racist and systemic biases. Oh, and one other thing that I wanted to mention is as part of both the short-term and the long-term goal is, or kind of like the avenues that we envision are first and foremost narrative work. I think language is key and very important. The example I was thinking of earlier today is if I told you that I wanted to get my friend who's a career criminal out of prison tomorrow, you might take an issue with it. Who wants a person deemed a career criminal to come home? But if I say, hey, my friend who's rehabilitated, if that's the language that makes you feel comfortable, you see it differently, you frame it differently. So just understanding the ways that we've become immersed in state-sanctioned language that objectifies and reduces people from their full humanity, and rejecting that language at every turn. And so creating new narratives around liberty, freedom, and non-incarceration, as well as policy proposals that do two things. One is that do not make categorical exclusions and pit certain disenfranchised or incarcerated populations against another. And secondly, to have policy, as Issa mentioned earlier, that doesn't expand or merely transform the carceral model, but instead removes it. So, like, don't build anything we have to tear down later is one of the things we try to do.
Yeah, and also just put a little link to a resource from Critical Resistance, a nonprofit started by Dr. Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis and other folks based here in Oakland, but also has chapters throughout the nation about reformist reform. I think that's really important. I think, like, whenever we're doing that work, if we're ever pushing to release some folks, that is also making it harder or building a brick wall for folks who are the most marginalized and are the most excluded systematically from these releases. But that's not a step that you can compromise on, period. And I think that we all need to be committed to that. Don't build anything we're gonna have to tear down later, for real.
I don't really see any questions in the chat, so I feel like we have some more questions that we prepared that I'd love to ask you. What are your tips for us as student organizers for building those relationships with folks inside and community organizers, kind of, given that a campus can be a bubble, and especially now we're away from campus, but we still are in community. What's your advice for us as organizers who've been doing this for longer?
You want me to go, James? Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's tons of collectives, Black-led collectives, organizations that are doing this work, that if that's an access point for you, then that's an access point for you. Like Ella Baker Center, we have virtual mail nights twice a month. And then if you're sending in responding to letters that we get in from across the state about folks needing support with their asking questions, needing support with the habeas petitions that are coming in right now for folks who are currently incarcerated at San Quentin, who have filed habeas petitions saying that their incarceration at San Quentin has violated their 8th Amendment rights, and that those cases are being heard right now and need information about how to get their case active. Folks who need to know what a commutation is and what the clemency process is. Those are things that I know I would not have been able to do if it wasn't for Emily at the Ella Baker Center, if it wasn't for Elliot at the Ella Baker Center, who really just sat me down as a loved one and was like, I don't know what to do and how to process all of this. What can I do? I think that can be really invaluable. And then from writing those letters, you can continue to have those connections and form relationships with folks inside. But I think that whenever we're having events where we're talking about incarceration, we really need to be pushing of how can we be including the voices and centering the voices of folks who are currently incarcerated, including just seeing how we can get folks on the call who are currently incarcerated, or folks like we did here, reading the demands that came directly from folks who are currently incarcerated at San Quentin. Those are their words. So that's something that I suggest of always doing that. What do you think, Jay? I'm sure y'all are doing a lot of this work already too.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that some things Issa mentioned at the very beginning is key. That those who are most directly impacted should lead, and those of us who have certain privileges and powers should be in a position to support and amplify and use and play more of a labor role. And I think that anytime when organizing, one of the first questions is who's not here, who's not at the table, who's not in the room, and working to build those relationships so that the organizing cohort, when it comes to the point where you're doing rapid response work or whatever you're doing, you're not, you've limited the blind spots, and everyone's already at the table and was part of the planning and the creating, and not just coming in to speak or do something on the tail end. So I think it's really important to build those relationships very early and consistently, and to never make the mistake of conflating privilege with merit and thinking just because you have access to power or whatever your privileges are, that somehow means that your ideas are better. But to be, enter into organizing with humility, centering or prioritizing those who are most directly impacted, and allowing us to just learn from each other.
Thank you. I think that wraps up the Q&A portion that we have prepared. And yeah, just thank you so much for joining us and sharing all of your wisdom and just the knowledge that you have from doing this work. And it's been a privilege to hear from you. And for folks who are still on the call, we want to do some of the actions that the coalition has prepared. So we're going to share out the calling scripts and emails that you can send out in the chat right now. So if you could stay on for a little longer and do some of those actions, we'd really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks again to Issa and James. Y'all don't have to stay for this bit, but yeah.
Thank you so much for inviting us and for taking the time to learn more about how you can connect and plug in and help support the liberation of people in California prisons. Really appreciate you.
Yeah, appreciate y'all too, and echoing the thanks. And yeah, I think it's like such a time to be building in community too. And I know like I think it can be overwhelming to like just try to like start in a new coalition or whatever, but just like really want to emphasize that this is super like these are folks who just like they got family, like we are folks who are formerly incarcerated, has family members inside, are organizing, are trying to throw down around this. And like this is the time, especially like with like Zoom and how accessible a lot of these spaces are. You don't have to be in Oakland in order to attend a meeting in Oakland, right? And so whether it's like y'all are looking at things like at Harvard, y'all looking at things in the Bay, like know that these spaces are absolutely open to you because we need everyone's hands to be helping move this movement forward. So yeah, I put the little bit.ly links for everything I could think of, including the updates one, and also to sign up for the listserv. And if you have questions, I'll put my email in the chat. And or if you have a loved one who's currently incarcerated and are needing support, definitely hit up folks and don't be shy, or be shy, but still send the email if it's helpful.
So I also posted the Google Doc in the chat, and I'm about to share my screen so y'all can see the scripts. So this is a doc that's updated with articles and current actions that I'm assuming most folks on this call can attend since it's in the Bay. But yeah, this is a really great resource to follow what's been going on at San Quentin. Trying to find the actions. Damn. Here are the scripts. So the links are in the document itself, so feel free to pull it up. And let's just take a minute to sign petitions and make these calls. All right. I'd appreciate if y'all could do these actions, continue doing them. But we just wanted to thank you all for attending, and I wanted to shout out Rhonda and Jarrett for helping plan this. And yeah, I hope that you come away with a better knowledge of what's going on the other coast. And yeah, it's been really great. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.